Is the United States on the verge of fracturing into multiple independent nations? I hope not, but I guess eventually, hundreds of years from now, maybe someday, nothing lasts forever. But it turns out a small minority of my fellow Americans are trying to make this happen sooner. They're seeking independence for their state, their region, or even their bioregion. So let's see who these groups are. Roll the music. Before I get started, there are a few things that I need to explain. One is that I hope that this video will be the first in a series examining secessionist movements in various countries, and it only seemed fair to start with my own country, the United States. This is not a full list of every secessionist group in America, it's just the ones that I find interesting and worthy of discussion. I am excluding groups which are overtly racist, violent, or just plain nutty. That's a personal call on my part. I just don't find these groups particularly interesting and don't want to draw any attention to them. I'm also sticking to movements which are either active now or have been active within living memory. And I'm not covering movements which are trying to redraw the state boundaries, the internal boundaries within the United States, like the Greater Idaho movement or the various attempts to create a state of Jefferson. That might be something I cover in another video someday, but there simply isn't room in this one. And lastly, just to be clear, I don't support any of these groups. In fact, as a general rule, I don't support secessionist groups at all, unless there are very specific circumstances, such as like what's happened in Somaliland. Despite America's many, many flaws, I don't think we're anywhere near a situation where an argument for secession can be justified. But I still think this is a really interesting topic to discuss, so here we go. Number 1, New England. New England, in case you don't know, is a totally unofficial but widely used term which refers to the 6 most northeasterly states in America. These are Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island. The name is rooted in the region's history, most notably the New England Confederation, formed in 1643, which was a short-lived military alliance formed between various colonies in the area. The name stuck, and the region does have distinct political and cultural traditions which set it apart from the rest of America. To a degree, I think as Americans we tend to exaggerate our regional differences a bit, but anyway. There are several unofficial but widely used New England flags, with a pine tree being the most consistent feature. New England also has its own professional football team, the New England Patriots. And while that might sound superficial, I think that's actually an important factor in maintaining a New England identity. In recent decades, the people in New England's 6 constituent states have tended to embrace the progressive side of America's cultural and political divides. And during the presidencies of George W. Bush and Donald Trump, a lot of New Englanders have felt alienated from their national government. This is a very real phenomenon all across America, and it's actually driving several of the independence movements I'm going to discuss. And it is quite a serious problem. What's happening is that Americans are increasingly sifting themselves into, say, a broad category we could call progressive and another broad category we could call conservative. And there's a tendency for people to move in geographic terms to live with people that are more like them. The geographic split is messy, but most of New England pretty much falls into the more progressive leaning category. The main group promoting independence for New England is called the New England Independence Campaign. It was founded by a man named Alex Gilbert, a resident of Maine, in 2014, and advocates a totally peaceful withdrawal of the New England states from the Union. The NEIC makes several different arguments for independence, including the cultural and political differences I've just mentioned. They also claim that New Englanders pay much more in taxes to the federal government than they get back, which is plausible. But there's another argument that they make, which I find especially interesting, that smaller countries have better governments. Their website even cites the examples of Norway and Monaco, 2 countries which are extremely different from New England. This same argument is regularly made by the Scottish National Party when it tries to promote independence for Scotland. They just say that Scottish people will be happier and more prosperous in a smaller country. Of course, I would say that the world order, which allows small countries to thrive, was created by and is maintained by larger countries like the United States and the United Kingdom. But, well, it's still an interesting concept. I found it pretty hard to gauge the size or popularity of the NEIC, but the group does receive a small but steady flow of media coverage. According to one recent article I found in the Stamford Advocate, the NEIC is focused less on the particulars of secession and more just building momentum for the cause, which sounds extremely sensible. How New England. Number 2, the Republic of Lakotah. If there's one group which arguably has the moral and legal right to separate itself from the rest of the country, it has to be America's indigenous peoples, known collectively as Native Americans or American Indians. Several Indians I've had the pleasure of knowing over the years have told me that they really don't like the term Native American. They see it as something that's been imposed on them by others. That was those people, but they're the ones I know. So I'm going to use the term Indian here. I'm guessing that could be controversial with some people. I hope I've got that right. If it offends anyone, I apologize in advance. Today, most American Indians belong to one of hundreds of tribal groups, most of which are recognized by the US federal government, and are accorded a sort of sovereignty. It's a very partial sovereignty rooted in treaties which were signed between the federal government and these tribes in the 19th and 20th centuries. And I gotta say, these are treaties that the federal government routinely and repeatedly broke. This is an extremely complicated topic, but the basic gist is that many tribal members who live on tribal lands, known as reservations, are often exempt from many state and federal laws. But in most respects, most recognized tribes cannot be considered sovereign countries. Tribal groups regularly lobby to try and regain their lost sovereignty, but most attempt this by working within the current system. Russell Means, a member of the Oglala Lakotah people and one of America's most prominent Indian activists, had a very different viewpoint. Before he died in 2012, Means was involved in 2 attempts to create independent Lakota nations, as in like fully blown countries. And one of the movements that he founded, the Republic of Lakotah, survives today, I think. Means rose to fame in the 1970s as a spokesman for the American Indian Movement, known as AIM. In 1973, at the invitation of local traditional leaders, AIM activists helped occupy the town of Wounded Knee in South Dakota on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation of the Oglala Lakotah people. This made national news, and federal officials surrounded the town and began regularly firing live ammunition at the occupiers. A few days later, occupation leaders went a step further and actually declared Wounded Knee to be an independent country, the Oglala Independent Nation, and a traditional leader and a translator actually traveled to New York to the UN to lobby for its recognition. The move to create a new country died with the end of the occupation, but for Russell Means, it was an idea that obviously lived on. Decades later, Means revived the idea of the independent Oglala nation, but on a much more ambitious scale in terms of territory. The 1851 Treaty of Fort Laramie between the federal government and the Oglala Lakotah people ceded huge amounts of land to the Oglala, land which covers multiple states today. The US government has repeatedly and flagrantly violated this treaty, almost from the moment that the ink dried. In 2007, Means and a group of activists traveled to Washington, D.C., where they demanded their land back and then notified the federal government their intention to create a new Republic of Lakotah on the land ceded to them by the 1851 treaty. Means then led his delegation to various embassies around Washington, D.C. to ask in person for recognition for his country, a process which was documented firsthand by a Washington Post reporter. It's a fascinating read. I'll put a link in a pinned comment. Unfortunately for Means, none of the diplomats he met with were willing to offer him recognition. Gauging how much support the Republic of Lakotah has today is difficult. Means was an absolute genius at drawing attention to his causes, but just getting attention doesn't mean that there's widespread support. None of the various recognized Lakota governments were supporting his cause. And with Means' death, the movement suffered a serious loss. According to its website, the Republic of Lakotah lives on, but the website itself has recently disappeared. I'll put an archive link below. Whatever you think of the idea of the Republic of Lakotah, it's undeniable that the American Indian people have suffered greatly at the hands of the US federal government. And I don't think the current arrangement really satisfies anyone. I don't think setting up fully independent enclave countries within the United States is actually a good idea. But of all the groups I'm discussing in this video, undoubtedly the American Indians have the best moral and legal claim to independence. Number 3, the California Republic. If you pay attention to California politics for more than 5 minutes, you'll undoubtedly hear a prominent politician compare California to an independent country. Specifically, you will hear that California would have the 5th largest economy in the world if it was independent. This is a constant drumbeat in California politics, and I think it's partly because of this self-image that California's state government is one of the more muscular and sort of active in America. California also has an extremely unusual feature on its state flag, an inscription which says California Republic. Like much of the western United States, California once belonged to Mexico. By 1846, much of the area was occupied by white American settlers, who then rose up and declared themselves to be an independent country for 25 days, and then invited the United States to annex them and admit them as a new state, the state of California, which it did. The California Republic of 1846 wasn't really all that real. There were no civil government institutions, and the military barely had any structure at all. It was really just a land grab by Americans. But the myth of a once independent California lives on today, especially in that flag. For most Californians, that's as far as they take the idea of independence. But there is a small group with a much more ambitious plan who want to take the idea that California is like an independent country all the way to its logical conclusion. The most significant group in this movement, in my opinion, is the California National Party, which was formed in 2015 and is slowly building some momentum. As of earlier this year, it has 425 members registered with the California government. It needs to get to 17,000 members before it becomes an official party, so it's got a ways to go, but it's a start. The CNP also recently ran its first candidate for office, its party chairman, Michael Loebs. The CNP's argument for independence is very similar to that of the New England Independence Campaign, that the values and politics of California are not in sync with the rest of the country, and that California pays far more in tax to the federal government than it receives back. But interestingly, the CNP's platform proposes a very gradual withdrawal from the United States. This includes a transition period in which California would become what's called a Commonwealth territory. That's the name that the US government gives to its quasi-colonial possessions, Guam and Puerto Rico. So I find that a bit odd. Also, I should mention there is another group called Yes California. But the guy that runs that, he's American, but he lives in Russia, and there's a lot of allegations that the whole thing is propped up by the Russian government, as are many of the organizations which claim to support secession for their region or state. So even though I think they've been getting more publicity than the California National Party, at least that's what someone from California told me recently, I wouldn't suggest taking these guys at all seriously. So just avoid Yes California. Clearly, the California independence movement is very small. But the fact that the state keeps constantly comparing itself to an independent country makes me think that someday the idea might form deeper roots and become more of a thing. Maybe, we'll see. Number 4, the Northwest Angle. In the 1700s, during the negotiations between the brand new United States and Great Britain, just after the American Revolution, the American government was accidentally granted this piece of land here, which is currently located in Minnesota and is known as the Northwest Angle. I say accidentally because the boundaries agreed in the treaty were based on some very inaccurate maps, and America ended up with this little nub of territory which was not connected by land to the rest of the country. Most of the Northwest Angle is uninhabited, and most of the land is owned by the Red Lake Band of Chippewa Indians. Very few people live permanently in the Angle, as it is known. The latest census had the population at just over 100, and the economy is mostly based on tourists coming in to stay at fishing resorts. In 1997, a group of local residents began complaining that the regulations they had to follow, being located in the US, were much tougher than the regulations that their competition had to face just across the lake in Canada, and that these regulations were hurting their business. They formed a campaign for the Angle to leave the American state of Minnesota and join the Canadian province of Manitoba. This campaign got a lot of attention, and in 1998, Minnesota Congressman Colin Peterson actually proposed an amendment to the US Constitution which would allow the residents of the Angle to vote in a referendum on whether they wanted to leave the US and join Canada. Now, constitutional amendments in America are extremely difficult to pass, and this one never had any chance of success, but just the fact that this was ever discussed in Congress, I think, is absolutely amazing. But then the Red Lake Band of Chippewa Indians I mentioned moments ago, they got involved. Now, their reservation is scattered in little different pockets of land across northern Minnesota, and I don't think they have any permanent residents in the Angle. It's mostly sort of fishing and hunting ground for them. But Unlike most US Indian tribes, they don't have private ownership of land. All the land in the tribe is owned collectively as a whole. This meant that if the angle was to join Manitoba, it would cause a really complicated legal headache for Manitoba and Canada, because you wouldn't just have like land and people joining, you'd have like a sovereign or semi-sovereign Indian tribe joining. It would just create a massive headache, and that sort of killed off the whole movement. But the US government eventually relented and loosened the fishing regulations for the residents of the Angle, so everyone was happy in the end. Number 5, the Republic of Texas. Texas is one of 2 US states, along with Hawaii, that actually has a decent history as an independent country before it joined the United States. In fact, I actually visited the location of the former Texas Embassy in London in a previous video. So yes, the Republic of Texas was once an independent country. Like California, Texas used to belong to Mexico, and like California, it was heavily settled by white Americans in the early 19th century. And like California, these white settlers eventually overthrew the Mexican authorities and then invited the US federal government to come in and make them a state. The main difference is that Texas had a history of independence that lasted for 10 years, not just 25 days. Texas's decade-long history as an independent state remains today a major part of the state's identity, and public consciousness of its history of independence has always been an important part of Texas life. In recent years, I would argue that pro-independence sentiment has basically split into 2 groups. You have right-wing crazies, and then a sort of state-sponsored sort of mythology thing. I'm not really interested in the right-wing crazies who are split across a variety of small groups, some of which are apparently funded by the Russian government. But I am interested in the way that state officials still continue to foster the mythology of the Republic of Texas for commercial and political gain. Here are 2 notable examples. The first is a state slogan which started as part of an anti-littering campaign in the 1980s, but has since gone on to spawn a huge souvenir industry. It is the slogan, "Don't mess with Texas." Now, that's not in any way a direct call for secession, but I just have to say as an American, there is no other state that would have a slogan like "Don't mess with Texas." I mean, it just captures that sense of sort of swashbuckling sort of independence that you expect from Texas, and that really no other state really even tries to do. In 1995, the Texas Tourist Board launched an even more blatant evocation of Texas's independent past with its slogan, "Texas. It's like a whole other country." Now, I remember when these commercials first appeared on television, and my immediate thought was, oh yeah, Texas, yeah, it used to be an independent country. And I think most Americans understood that was the reference, even though, again, the commercial doesn't blatantly say that Texas should be independent. And to be honest, that sort of ad just wouldn't work for any other state. And knowing that the idea of independence and talking it up from time to time is broadly popular among Texans, prominent politicians make overtures to a return to independence on a surprisingly regular basis. In 2009, then-Governor Rick Perry openly speculated about Texas seceding from the United States on camera. He later denied that this is what he'd done, but he did. When the Supreme Court recently refused to hear a case from the Texas Attorney General contesting the results of the 2020 presidential election, Texas Republican Party Chairman Allen West floated the idea that Texas should leave the United States and form a union with other, quote, law-abiding states. And just under a year ago, a member of the Texas legislature filed a bill calling for a referendum on Texas independence. Texit, if you will. The bill failed to get out of the committee stage, but its sponsor, Representative Kyle Biederman, is serious and says that he will put forward more legislation like this in future. Unlike California or New England, Texas lacks a credible and coherent political force to advocate for its independence, at least not one that normal people would want to engage with. But I would say it draws on a much deeper well of public sentiment than these other campaigns can claim. Could Texas become independent again one day? Maybe. I think it's unlikely to happen in my lifetime or even this century. I mean, it could happen if there was an apocalypse. Pretty much every representation of post-apocalyptic America these days seems to have a revived Republic of Texas in it, so who knows? Number 6, Alaska. Of all the independence movements in the United States, the one for Alaska can claim the most political success. A candidate from the Alaska Independence Party, or AIP, was actually elected governor of the state in 1990. But while this is extremely impressive, it's not exactly as significant as it seems. Let me explain. Alaska is not connected by land to the rest of the United States. To drive there, you have to go on a very long journey through Canada. And unlike the rest of America, Alaska was settled by Russians who were traveling east, not west. Russia sold Alaska to the US government in 1867, but it wasn't until 1958 that Alaska residents were given the option of becoming a state, something that they voted for overwhelmingly in a referendum. The main objective of the Alaska Independence Party, which was formed in 1984, is to hold a rerun of that 1958 referendum. They argue that it was invalid because voters were not given a third option. They were only allowed to choose between statehood and continued territory status. For a relatively fringe political movement, the AIP was reasonably successful, I guess, but never had a significant breakthrough. That is until 1990, when former Alaska Governor Walter Hickel put forward his name for the AIP nomination for governor. Now, Hickel was upset that the Republican Party, which he had always belonged to, had put forward a candidate for governor that he didn't think was conservative enough, and he wanted to be able to run against that candidate. Now, he couldn't run against him as a Republican because that guy already had the nomination. So he approached the AIP, who had what's called ballot status, which allows them to automatically appear on the ballot, and said, "Can I be your candidate?" And they said yes. Now, Hickel argued vehemently for Alaska to choose statehood in the 1958 referendum. So this was a really odd decision by the Alaska Independence Party. There was no real chance that Hickel was really going to ever support independence, but he could win, or at least get them a better result than they had ever hoped before, so I guess they decided to go for it. Hickel did win. He got 38% of the vote, which in a tight three-way race was enough for him to become the next governor. Unsurprisingly, he refused to hold the referendum that the AIP wanted, and he actually left the AIP and rejoined the Republican Party a few months before the end of his term. So, despite the fact that was a bit of a failure, the AIP does remain, at least on paper, one of the strongest secessionist movements in the United States. It currently has 19,000 registered voters. It also regularly finishes in third or fourth place in elections in Alaska, which is pretty good. Today, the party's platform tends to be more about promoting Alaska in general rather than calling for independence, but, things could shift in future. I mean, Alaska is not connected to the rest of the country, so it seems plausible that someday, and I mean no time soon really, but circumstances could change when Alaskan independence seems more realistic. Number 7, Hawaii. I mentioned Hawaii previously. This is the state with the longest pedigree as an independent country before it formally joined the Union, which it did relatively recently in 1960. Now, I have to admit my knowledge of Hawaiian history is embarrassingly limited. Hawaii is just really not covered in US history classes, and in my school textbooks, it just didn't get a mention until the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941. It's like it just sort of suddenly appeared in American history. And then as soon as that happened, we pretty much stopped talking about it. So what I learned about Hawaii growing up was mostly from television, like the epic 1980s detective show Magnum P.I. But I'm going to do my best, and I hope that American students in future get to learn more about Hawaii in school. So Hawaii is a chain of islands sitting in the middle of the Pacific. It's not even technically part of the Americas. The people of these islands began uniting together under a single king starting in 1795, a process which concluded in 1810 and created the Kingdom of Hawaii. The Kingdom of Hawaii was recognized by the major powers of the day, including Great Britain, France, and, crucially, the United States. It was the first country outside of Europe or without a European colonial history to be recognized by these major powers. In 1893, however, a story which should sound very familiar at this point began to take place. A group of American settlers who had been coming to the island in past decades rose up and overthrew the legitimate monarch, Queen Liliuokalani. They declared first a provisional government and later the Republic of Hawaii. But it is widely believed that the conspirators' ultimate goal was for Hawaii to be annexed by the United States, which is what happened 5 years later in 1898. In 1959, a referendum was held on Hawaii becoming America's 50th state. The referendum passed overwhelmingly, but crucially, there were only two options on the ballot: becoming a state or remaining a territory. There was no option for Hawaii to return to its former status as an independent country. Because of its unique and extensive history as an independent country, the independence movement in Hawaii is much more complicated than it is in other places I'm covering. To be honest, it's not something I could really do justice to in this short segment of this video. But here's a brief outline of the most common positions that the major groups take. Several groups want to restore Hawaii to its former state as a monarchy. And there are even some people who seem to be taken reasonably seriously who claim to be the legitimate king of Hawaii. Several other groups, including the Nation of Hawaii and Kahului, seek independence, but as a republic with democratically elected leaders. And lastly, there are some groups which are pushing for Native Hawaiians to be treated similarly to American Indian groups on the US mainland, a nation within a nation, so to speak. But from what I can tell, many, if not most of the people in the Hawaiian sovereignty movement have no desire to be considered a federally recognized tribe. They want full independence from the United States. I don't think they're likely to get it anytime soon, but they certainly have a case to make. Number 8, Cascadia. Cascadia is different from any of the other independence movements I've discussed on this video on 2 counts. First, this is not a country which would secede just from the US. The most common proposal for a Republic of Cascadia I've seen would draw territory from 7 US states, plus the Canadian province of British Columbia and a little part of the Canadian territory of the Yukon. The other big difference is the reason for Cascadia's unusual-looking boundaries. Cascadia is a bioregion, a territory defined by physical and environmental features like the directions that rivers and water flow, soil types, and that sort of thing. The belief is that these physical characteristics have a major impact on the politics, economics, and culture of the people living in each bioregion. I've traveled through most of what's being proposed for Cascadia, and I actually lived on the very edge of it for several years. And I would admit there is something to this idea of a bioregion, maybe. The western parts of Washington State, Oregon, and British Columbia, and the northern part of California definitely have a unique vibe, I guess, which is pretty consistent across that region. From what I can see, the people living in those particular regions do tend to be more progressive in their politics and more attuned to the environment. But in the rest of the proposed Cascadia, like Idaho, Eastern Washington, Eastern Oregon, these tend to be very conservative communities that engage in large-scale intensive farming. So really not such a good match. Maybe because of this, sometimes the proposed boundaries for Cascadia you see are just limited to Oregon, Washington, and BC. But even then, the eastern parts of these territories really don't match up so much culturally with the West. One early influence on the idea of Cascadia was a utopian novel called Ecotopia, which was published in 1975, written by Ernest Callenbach. In the novel, Ecotopia is a country which broke away from the United States and is formed of Washington, Oregon, and Northern California. The novel takes place about 30 years later, and Ecotopia is described as being technologically advanced, focused on sustainable living, very tolerant of different gender roles, and very sexually liberated, and very big on legalized cannabis. I saw several copies of this book floating around during my student days. It's that kind of book. From what I can see, the modern version of Cascadia does draw a lot on Kallenbach's vision of utopia. There are several prominent groups promoting the Cascadian cause. The major ones, as far as I can tell, are Cascadia Now, which promotes the idea of Cascadia more as a social movement rather than a purely political one. There's the Cascadia Department of Bioregion, which sort of promotes itself as a sort of pretend government department. It focuses on bioregionalism generally, but specifically promotes it for Cascadia. And the Cascadia Bioregional Party, which is the only organization I found that is primarily political in focus. It's very new. It was only set up at the end of 2020. And from what I can see, they've not yet started running candidates for office in the US or Canada. This website made me a little bit suspicious. It contains a lot of grammatical errors, and as you may have noticed, there are lots of groups which are sort of Russian-backed, trying to pretend to be legitimate secessionist movements in the US. I don't think this is one of them, but still it made me a little bit uneasy. So if you're interested in this group, just check it out carefully. And if you are this group, I don't mean any offense by that, just fix your website. Beyond these groups, the idea of Cascadia does seem to have a lot of cultural traction in Oregon, Washington, and British Columbia. Most visibly, the Cascadia flag, also known as the Doug flag, is used prominently by fans of the 3 Major League Soccer franchises in the region. That would be the Portland Timbers, the Seattle Sounders, and the Vancouver Whitecaps. The Sounders actually recently added the Doug flag to the back of their uniform. And since 2004, the best performing club from this group is awarded a trophy by their fans, which is known as the Cascadia Cup. Also, of any of the movements I've discussed in this video, Cascadia has by far the best merch. The Cascadia Department of Bioregion has a particularly good online store. You can even buy a passport if you want to. But there's also lots of Cascadia stuff on eBay and Etsy. It's all over the place. So if you're interested, go online and look around. Regarding the chances of an independent Cascadia ever emerging, well, I don't think it's likely to happen anytime soon. But the Cascadia movement seems to be as much about establishing a common identity across the region as promoting political change. And on that front, Cascadia does seem to be happening. From what I can see, for many people, the goal of Cascadia is to offer an alternative to the traditional nation-state. And it's not beyond the scope of possibility that someday the major nation-states in North America might not be around anymore. We've only had nation-states for like 500 years, so who knows what we'll have 500 years from now. If that happened, would an independent Cascadia emerge? Well, who knows. But, it's nice to think about. So that's my rundown of the major American secessionist movements, the ones I think are interesting anyway. There are several that I've left out, mostly on purpose, but if there's one that you think I should have included, let me know in the comments. Also, let me know if there are any of these movements that surprised you, and if you dare, let me know if you support any of the movements I've mentioned. Thanks for watching. I'll see you guys in the next video.